Cold steel pressed directly against Darius Sterling's temple. The hand gripping the Glock 19 trembled with a toxic mix of adrenaline and unjustified rage. Officer Colton Reed wore a smirk of absolute authority, entirely convinced he had just cornered a common criminal under the flickering fluorescent glare of an Oak Creek parking lot. What the arrogant patrolman didn't know, however, was that the black man sitting calmly in the driver's seat wasn't a late-night suspect. He was Supervisory Special Agent Darius Sterling of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. In mere seconds, Reed's ego-driven traffic stop was about to become the final catastrophic mistake of his law enforcement career. The rain had been coming down in sheets for hours, turning the asphalt of the Oak Creek Plaza into a slick black mirror reflecting the flickering neon sign of an abandoned diner. Inside an unmarked navy blue Ford Explorer, Darius Sterling rubbed his eyes, the fatigue of a long shift settling deep into his bones. Darius wasn't just any federal agent. At 42, he was a highly decorated operative working out of the Bureau's Public Corruption Unit. For months, he had been meticulously building a case against a localized ring of extortion and evidence tampering within the Oak Creek Police Department. It was a tedious, ugly assignment. Investigating other men with badges always left a sour taste in his mouth. But Darius believed in the law with a quiet, unyielding ferocity. He was going over the files of his primary targets, one of which included a notoriously aggressive patrolman named Colton Reed, whose excessive force complaints had been buried by a corrupt union rep named Curtis Hammond. Darius took a sip of his lukewarm coffee and reached for the ignition. He was done for the night. He just wanted to get back to his hotel, call his wife, and sleep. Before his fingers could turn the key, the interior of his SUV was suddenly flooded with a blinding, harsh white light. A patrol cruiser had silently rolled up behind him, blocking him in completely. The spotlight on the driver's side pillar of the cruiser was angled directly into Darius's rearview mirror, effectively blinding him. Darius sighed, resting his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. He knew the drill. Even with a badge in his pocket, he was a black man in a dark car in an empty parking lot late at night. He knew exactly how this could go if he wasn't careful. He waited, expecting the standard procedure. An officer approaching, asking for ID, a quick explanation, and a mutual nod of professional courtesy. But Officer Colton Reed didn't do standard procedure. Reed stepped out of his cruiser, the heavy thud of his boots echoing in the damp night air. Reed was a man who wore his badge not as a shield for the public, but as a weapon for his own ego. He had a history of shattering the jaw of a civilian during a routine traffic stop, a case that had cost the city a quiet settlement. He was a bully, plain and simple, and tonight he was bored. Reed didn't approach cautiously. He marched up to the driver's side window, unclipped the retention strap on his holster, and slammed his heavy maglite flashlight against the glass. Bang, bang, bang. Roll it down. Now, Reed barked, his voice muffled but aggressive through the thick glass. Darius remained perfectly calm. He pressed the button, the window lowering with a quiet hum. The smell of wet asphalt and Reed's cheap cologne filled the cabin. "Evening, officer," Darius said, his voice deep, steady, and devoid of the fear Reed was clearly hoping to elicit. "How can I help you?" "Engine off. Keys on the dash. Now," Reed commanded, shining the high-lumen flashlight directly into Darius's eyes. "Officer, if you'll just lower the light for a second, I can explain." "I didn't ask for an explanation, buddy. I said keys on the dash." Reed's hand was resting aggressively on the butt of his sidearm. Darius complied smoothly. He turned the key, pulled it from the ignition, and placed it on the dashboard where it was clearly visible. He then returned his hands to the steering wheel. "Done. Now what seems to be the problem?" Reed leaned in, his eyes scanning the interior of the car. looking for anything he could use as probable cause. He saw a well-dressed black man in a high-end vehicle. In Reed's prejudiced, narrow worldview, this equation only had one answer. "The problem is," Reed sneered, his tone dripping with condescension, "we've had a lot of break-ins in this area, and you don't look like you belong in this neighborhood, boy. What are you doing here?" Darius's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Boy. There it was. The mask was already slipping, revealing the ugly reality beneath the uniform. Darius felt the familiar, cold knot of anger in his stomach, but his training and his intellect kept it firmly locked away. He was sitting on a mountain of evidence that could put this very cop in federal prison. "I'm just passing through, officer," Darius said evenly. "I pulled over to check an email before getting on the highway. I haven't broken any laws." "I'll be the judge of that," Reed snapped. "Let me see your ID, and keep your hands where I can see them." Darius looked at him. "My wallet is in my inside left jacket pocket. My identification is in there. I'm going to reach for it slowly with my right hand. Is that understood?" Reed's eyes narrowed. He hated when civilians spoke to him with authority. He hated the calm, articulate way this man was behaving. It challenged his dominance. "Stop running your mouth and get the ID," Reed said, taking a half-step back. Darius slowly, deliberately moved his right hand toward his chest. Before his fingers even brushed the lapel of his jacket, Reed screamed, "Gun! Drop it! Drop it!" In a fraction of a second, the situation went from a tense encounter to a deadly standoff. Reed drew his Glock 19, stepping off the X, and leveled the weapon directly at Darius's head. His finger was hovering dangerously close to the trigger. "Keep your hands on the wheel. If you move, I will blow your head off," Reed roared, his voice cracking with a manic, terrifying energy. Darius froze instantly. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his breathing remained controlled. He had been in firefights in cartel safe houses. He had negotiated with armed hostiles, but this, a rogue cop looking for an excuse to pull the trigger in a dark parking lot, was infinitely more dangerous because it was entirely irrational. "My hands are on the wheel," Darius said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the rain. "I do not have a weapon in my jacket. I am reaching for my identification." "Shut up, shut up." Reed was hyperventilating slightly. He had escalated the situation artificially, creating a false threat to justify his own aggression. "Get out of the car. Use your left hand to open the door. Keep your right hand on the wheel." Darius calculated his odds. If he refused, Reed, operating on pure adrenaline and racial bias, might just shoot him through the door. If he complied, he surrendered the limited protection the vehicle offered. He decided compliance was the safest route to staying alive long enough to destroy this man's life legally. "I am opening the door," Darius announced slowly. He pulled the latch. The heavy door swung open. "Get out. Face down on the ground. Now." Darius stepped out into the freezing rain. The pavement was cold and wet, biting through the fine wool of his suit trousers as he lowered himself to his knees, then flat onto his stomach. He spread his arms out wide. Reed approached, his gun still trained on Darius's back. He jammed his knee violently into the space between Darius's shoulder blades, pressing his face into the gritty, wet asphalt. "Thought you were smart, didn't you?" Reed hissed, grabbing Darius's left wrist and wrenching it behind his back with unnecessary force. "Think you can come into my town and give me attitude?" "You are making a profound mistake, officer," Darius said, his voice muffled by the pavement but steady as a metronome. "I suggest you take a breath. Look in my inside jacket pocket and look at the credentials." "I'll look at whatever I want to look at when you're in cuffs," Reed spat. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal clinking in the night. But as Reed fumbled with his cuffs with one hand, keeping the gun pressed against the back of Darius's neck with the other, A voice crackled loudly over Reed's shoulder radio. Unit 4. Unit 4. This is dispatch. Chief Thorpe is requesting a 1020 on all units in Sector 3. Reed frowned, keying his mic with his free hand. Unit 4, I'm at the Oak Creek Plaza. I have a 1015 in progress. Suspect is uncooperative. Send backup. Copy. Unit 4. Be advised. Chief Thorpe is in the vicinity and is rolling to your location. Reed's stomach dropped slightly. Chief Victor Thorpe was relatively new to Oak Creek. He was an outside hire, brought in by the mayor to clean up the department's tarnished image. Thorpe was an old-school by-the-book leader who loathed officers who played loose with the rules. Reed had already received 2 formal reprimands from Thorpe in recent months. Chief doesn't need to come out here, Reed muttered to himself, suddenly feeling a spike of anxiety. He looked down at the man beneath him. He needed this to look like a legitimate, dangerous bust. He roughly patted down Darius's sides. He didn't feel a gun. He patted down the legs. Nothing. Where is it? Reed demanded, pressing his knee harder into Darius's spine. Where's the weapon you were reaching for? There is no weapon, Darius replied calmly. I told you. Wallet. Left inside pocket. You are currently assaulting a federal agent. Reed froze. He let out a harsh, derisive bark of laughter. A federal agent? Yeah, right. And I'm the President of the United States. Nice try, buddy. But doubt, cold and sharp, finally began to creep into the edges of Reed's mind. The man's demeanor, the expensive, unmarked car, the sheer lack of panic. Suspects usually cried, swore, or fought. This man was treating the situation like a minor inconvenience, documenting every protocol violation in his head. Reed reached down, keeping his gun aimed at Darius's head, and dug his fingers into the inside pocket of Darius's tailored jacket. His fingers brushed against smooth, stiff leather. He pulled it out. It wasn't a standard bifold wallet. Reed flipped it open under the glare of his flashlight. Gold gleamed back at him. It was a heavy, undeniably authentic shield. Beside it, an identification card bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. Darius Sterling, Supervisory Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The blood drained entirely from Colton Reed's face. The heavy maglite trembled in his hand. The aggressive, racist swagger evaporated in a single, terrifying instant, replaced by a profound, sickening realization. He hadn't just profiled an innocent civilian. He had held a gun to the head of a high-ranking federal operative. Before Reed could formulate a single coherent thought, the wail of sirens pierced the night. Tires screeched as 2 patrol cars, followed immediately by a sleek black SUV, tore into the parking lot, their light bars painting the rain-soaked buildings in frantic strokes of red and blue. The doors of the arriving vehicles flew open. 4 patrol officers spilled out, drawing their weapons, unsure of what they were walking into based on Reed's radio call. But it was the man who stepped out of the black SUV who commanded the scene. Chief Victor Thorpe was a towering man in his late 50s with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen decades of street work. He wore a heavy rain slicker over his uniform. He took one look at the scene. Officer Reed with his knee in the back of a man pinned to the wet pavement, a gun pointed at his head, holding a leather credential case in his other hand, and his instincts immediately screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. "Hold your fire! Weapons down!" Thorpe roared at the arriving officers, his voice booming over the rain. He marched directly toward Reed. "Reed, what the hell's going on here?" Reed looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide with a sudden desperate panic. He looked from the FBI credentials in his hand to his chief. He slowly lowered his gun but didn't holster it. "Chief, he was acting suspicious. I thought he was reaching for a weapon." Reed stammered, his previous bravado entirely gone. Get your knee off him. Step back now, Thorpe commanded. Reed complied, stumbling backward as if he were in a trance, dropping the leather wallet onto the wet pavement. Darius Sterling didn't jump up. He didn't yell. He calmly pushed himself up off the wet asphalt, brushing the grit from his soaked suit jacket. He reached down, picked up his credentials, wiped the water off the badge with his thumb, and snapped the case shut. He turned to face Chief Thorpe. The two men locked eyes. Thorpe recognized him instantly. They had sat in a secure conference room at the federal building just weeks prior, discussing the joint task force operations. Thorpe knew exactly why Sterling was in Oak Creek, and he knew exactly the kind of officers Sterling was looking into. Thorpe's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. He turned slowly to look at Colton Reed. "Chief, I didn't know," Reed babbled, his voice high-pitched and frantic. He didn't identify himself properly. He was in a dark area, in a nice car. He reached into his coat. It was standard procedure. "Chief, I feared for my life." "You feared for your life?" Darius spoke up. His voice was no longer just calm. It was laced with the cold, hard authority of a man who held the power to destroy lives. He stepped forward, ignoring the other officers who were now watching the exchange in stunned silence. "You didn't ask for identification properly," Darius stated clearly, his eyes locked on Reed. "You approached my vehicle aggressively. You used racially coded language. You ordered me to reach for my identification, and when I complied, you drew your weapon and threatened to execute me. You then assaulted me." Darius turned to Thorpe. "Chief Thorpe, we have a lot to discuss, starting with the fact that your officer here was perfectly willing to pull the trigger on an unarmed man solely based on his own prejudices." Thorpe didn't need to hear any more. He had seen the dashcam footage of Reed's previous encounters. He knew the complaints the Union had buried. Seeing it culminate in this, a federal agent assaulted and held at gunpoint, was the final, absolute straw. Thorpe walked right up to Reed, invading his personal space. The chief's eyes were like chips of flint. "Officer Reed," Thorpe said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Secure your weapon." "Chief, please. You have to listen to me. Secure your goddamn weapon right now, or I will have these officers take you down." Trembling, Reed holstered his Glock. "Now take off your belt. Hand it to Sergeant Davis," Thorpe ordered, pointing to one of the backup officers. "Chief, you can't do this. The Union." "The Union isn't going to save you from federal civil rights charges, Colton," Thorpe interrupted, his voice laced with disgust. "You are stripped of your police powers, effective immediately. You are terminated from the Oak Creek Police Department." Reed gasped, taking a step back as if he had been struck. "Fired? You can't fire me on the spot. There's a process. There's an investigation." "Oh, there will be an investigation," Darius chimed in, stepping up beside the chief. He looked Reed up and down with clinical detachment. "But it won't be internal affairs. It will be the Department of Justice, and I will personally oversee the civil rights violation file." Reed looked around wildly at the other officers, looking for support, for someone to step in. But his colleagues just stared at him. Some with shock, others with undisguised contempt. They all knew Reed was a liability. Now the bill had come due. "Hand over the belt, Colton," Sergeant Davis said quietly, stepping forward. Defeated, humiliated, and suddenly his life as he knew it was entirely over, Reed unbuckled his duty belt. The heavy leather, weighed down by the gun, the taser, and the cuffs, the tools of the power he had abused for so long, slammed onto the wet pavement. "Take him to lockup," Thorpe ordered the sergeant. "Process him for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon." "Wait, lockup? You're arresting me?" Reed cried out as Davis grabbed his arm and slapped a pair of handcuffs on his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin. A sensation he had inflicted on countless others finally turned on him. "You pointed a loaded firearm at a federal agent without cause," Thorpe said, turning his back on Reed. "You're lucky he didn't put a bullet in you." As Reed was dragged away, whining and pleading into the rainy night, Darius stood beside Chief Thorpe. The adrenaline was finally beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold exhaustion. "Agent Sterling," Thorpe said quietly, looking at the blinking lights of the cruiser driving Reed away. "I am deeply, profoundly sorry." "Don't apologize for him, Chief," Darius replied, adjusting his wet jacket. "Apologize for the system that kept him on the street this long. Now, would you like to see the rest of the files I have in my car?" The morning sun did nothing to wash away the grim reality settling over the Oak Creek Police Department. At the precinct, the air was a hive of nervous whispers. Cops huddled by the coffee machine, casting sideways glances at Chief Victor Thorpe's closed office door. Word had spread like a brush fire. Colton Reed, the untouchable golden boy of the precinct's aggressive street crimes faction, was currently sitting in a holding cell in the basement, stripped of his badge, his gun, and his dignity. Inside the chief's office, the air was thick with hostility. Curtis Hammond, the president of the Oak Creek Police Benevolent Association, paced the length of Thorpe's threadbare carpet. Hammond was a bulldog of a man, his neck thick and his face perpetually flushed with indignation. He was flanked by Nolan Graves, a high-priced defense attorney retained exclusively by the union to keep dirty cops on the street. "You are completely out of line, Victor," Hammond barked, slamming his meaty palms onto the chief's desk. "You cannot terminate a vested officer on the spot. There are protocols, there is due process, Garrity rights. You bypassed internal affairs completely. The union is going to bury you in injunctions before lunch." Chief Thorpe sat behind his desk, sipping black coffee. He looked tired but entirely resolute. Colton Reed pointed a loaded firearm at the head of a supervisory special agent of the FBI without a shred of probable cause, Curtis. He engaged in textbook racial profiling, illegal detention, and aggravated assault under color of law. "Allegedly," Attorney Nolan Graves interjected, adjusting his silk tie. "We have one man's word against an officer with years on the force." Reed states the suspect made a sudden, furtive movement toward his jacket in the dark in a high-crime area. Reed's actions were entirely within the scope of reasonable use of force. Your so-called FBI agent failed to identify himself properly. He didn't get the chance. A calm, deep voice echoed from the doorway. Darius Sterling stepped into the office. He had changed into a crisp, charcoal gray suit, looking every inch the federal authority he was. He carried a thick manila folder under his arm. Hammond sneered. "And here he is, the Fed who thinks he can waltz into our town and dictate how we police our streets. Let me tell you something, Agent Sterling." "Save the performance, Hammond," Darius interrupted, his voice freezing the room. He walked over to Thorpe's desk and set the folder down. "I'm not here to debate departmental policy. I'm here to inform you of the federal indictments." Hammond stopped pacing. Graves's eyes narrowed. "Indictments? Plural?" "That's right," Darius said, turning to face them. "Officer Reed is currently being transferred to federal custody. He's being charged under 18 U.S.C., Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. Given that he used a deadly weapon, he's looking at a maximum of 10 years in federal prison for last night alone. But that's just the appetizer." Graves scoffed, though it sounded forced. "You don't have the evidence to make a civil rights charge stick. You need to prove intent. You need to prove malice. You have no video. We all know Reed's body cam malfunctioned due to the heavy rain. It's your word against his." Chief Thorpe leaned forward, a grim, satisfied smile touching the corners of his mouth. "That's where you're wrong, counselor." Thorpe picked up a small remote from his desk and pointed it at the wall-mounted television. When I took over this department, I knew we had a culture problem. I also knew guys like Reed had a habit of pinching the wires on their body cams or forgetting to turn on their dash audio. The screen flickered to life. It showed the grainy, black and white dash cam footage from Reed's cruiser. I had my new tech division install secondary, tamper-proof microphones and cloud uplink backups in the cruisers of specific officers who had a history of excessive force complaints, Thorpe explained coldly. Reed had no idea it was recording. The audio flooded the room. Clear as day, Reed's voice echoed out. "You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood, boy." Then came Darius's calm, compliant voice, followed immediately by Reed's unhinged escalation, the sound of the gun being drawn, and the sickening thud of Reed throwing Darius onto the wet pavement. Hammond's face drained of color. The bluster vanished instantly. He looked at Graves, whose professional composure was rapidly crumbling. They both knew that tape was a death sentence in a courtroom. It wasn't just excessive force. The racial slur provided the undeniable proof of discriminatory intent required for a slam-dunk federal civil rights conviction. "But we aren't just here for Reed," Darius continued, tapping the manila folder. "This folder contains months of wiretaps, financial records, and sworn testimonies from local business owners. It details a systematic extortion ring run by Reed and 3 other officers, and it details how you, Mr. Hammond, used union funds to pay off witnesses and bury the internal complaints." The room went dead silent. The trap hadn't just closed on Colton Reed, it had snapped shut on the entire corrupt hierarchy of Oak Creek. "You're out of your jurisdiction," Hammond stammered, taking a step back toward the door. "This is a witch hunt." "Actually, Curtis," Darius said, checking his watch. "As of minutes ago, the FBI's regional SWAT team began executing a no-knock federal search warrant on your union headquarters. We are seizing all computers, ledgers, and communication devices. You are officially the target of a RICO investigation." Hours later, the illusion of Colton Reed's power had entirely evaporated. He sat in an interrogation room at the federal courthouse, miles away from the town he used to terrorize. He was no longer wearing his tailored uniform or his heavy, intimidating duty belt. Instead, he wore an oversized, scratchy orange jumpsuit. His hands, which had so confidently held a Glock to Darius Sterling's head, were now shackled to the heavy steel table bolted to the floor. The door clicked open, and Darius Sterling walked in, accompanied by Assistant United States Attorney Elias Wyatt. They sat down across from him. Reed looked terrible. He hadn't slept. The reality of federal lockup, the stripping away of his identity, the cold, clinical efficiency of the U.S. Marshals had shattered his ego. The karma he had evaded for years had finally caught up, and it hit with the force of a freight train. "Good morning, Colton," Darius said, his tone professional, devoid of the anger Reed had expected. This wasn't personal for Darius. It was pest control. Reed looked at his lawyer, Nolan Graves, who sat beside him looking entirely detached. "We're here to discuss a proffer agreement," AUSA Wyatt began, opening his briefcase. "Before we begin, Mr. Reed, I want to make your reality incredibly clear. We have the dash cam footage. We have your badge and the gun you used to assault a federal officer. But more importantly, the civil suit embargo has broken." Reed swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" "It means," Darius leaned in, "that the family of Malcolm Brooks, the young man whose jaw you shattered years ago, saw your mug shot on the evening news. The local DA has reopened the criminal investigation into that assault based on the new pattern of behavior we've established. Furthermore, because you are being fired for criminal cause, the city of Oak Creek is invoking a morality clause to strip your pension. Reed's breathing hitched. My pension? They can't do that. I have a wife, I have a mortgage. Your wife filed for divorce yesterday afternoon, Colton, Graves said quietly, speaking for the first time. She retained counsel the moment the FBI raided your house to seize your secondary weapons. Your bank accounts have been frozen pending the RICO investigation into the extortion ring. A tear tracked through the stubble on Reed's cheek. He was completely, utterly ruined. The shield he had used to hide his cruelty was gone, leaving him exposed to the full, unyielding weight of the justice system. You're looking at years, Colton, Wyatt stated plainly. Minimum. You will be placed in a federal penitentiary. As a former cop, you will be in solitary confinement for your own protection for the next decade. You will lose everything. Reed looked down at his shackled hands, his chest heaving with silent sobs. The arrogant predator in the parking lot was dead. Only a terrified, broken man remained. What do you want? Reed whispered, his voice cracking. Darius slid a document across the table. We want Curtis Hammond. We want the names of the commanding officers who took a cut of the extortion money. We want every single dirty secret the Oak Creek Union has been burying for years. Graves put a hand on Reed's arm. Colton, I have to advise you. If you testify against Hammond, the Union will not cover your legal fees. I will have to step down as your counsel. You will be on your own. Reed looked at Graves, a sudden sharp realization piercing through his panic. Graves wasn't there to protect him. Graves was there to make sure he kept his mouth shut to protect Hammond and the Union. Reed had been a loyal soldier for a corrupt system, and the moment he became a liability, they threw him to the wolves. Reed stared at the federal agent sitting across from him, the black man he had profiled, degraded, and threatened to murder just nights ago. Sterling wasn't gloating. He was simply doing the job Reed had sworn an oath to do, but had bastardized instead. Karma wasn't just an abstract concept. It was the man in the charcoal suit sitting across the table holding the pen that would dictate the rest of Reed's life. Reed violently shook off Graves's hand. He looked at Darius with bloodshot, defeated eyes. I want a public defender, Reed croaked, his voice filled with venom for his former allies, and I want a pen. I'll give you Hammond. I'll give you everyone. Darius Sterling nodded slowly, pushing a black ballpoint pen across the stainless steel table. Start at the beginning, Colton. Leave nothing out. Months after the rainy encounter in the Oak Creek Plaza, the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse in downtown Chicago became the epicenter of a legal earthquake. The trial of the United States versus Curtis Hammond, et al., was no longer just a localized scandal. It had morphed into a sprawling, nationally televised autopsy of systemic police corruption. Barricades lined the streets, holding back a chaotic throng of reporters, camera crews, and protesters carrying signs demanding accountability. Inside courtroom 1419, however, the noise of the outside world was suffocated by the heavy, mahogany-paneled walls and the frigid air conditioning. Judge Eleanor Taft, a formidable jurist with a reputation for mercilessly dismantling public corruption, presided from the elevated bench. She surveyed the room with hawkish intensity. At the defense table sat Curtis Hammond, the formerly untouchable president of the Oak Creek Police Benevolent Association. The swagger that once defined him had evaporated, leaving behind a pale, nervously sweating man drowning in an ill-fitting gray suit. His high-priced defense attorney, Nolan Graves, sat beside him furiously reviewing notes, looking more like a man bracing for an execution than preparing a defense. They were facing a mountain of wiretaps and financial records assembled by the FBI, but the prosecution's killing blow had yet to be delivered. Supervisory Special Agent Darius Sterling sat rigidly in the front row of the gallery. His tailored charcoal suit was a stark contrast to the sea of nervous energy around him. Beside him, Assistant United States Attorney Elias Wyatt stood up, smoothing the lapels of his jacket. The prosecution calls Gregory Reed to the stand, Wyatt announced, his voice ringing clear across the hushed courtroom. A heavy side door clicked open, and the breath collectively hitched in the gallery's throat. Two armed United States Marshals escorted Reed into the room. He was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, aggressive patrolman who had pressed a Glock to Darius Sterling's temple. Months in federal pretrial solitary confinement had stripped away his false bravado and aged him a decade. His frame was gaunt, his face sallow, and his once neatly trimmed hair was overgrown and streaked with stark white. He shuffled forward, wearing a drab olive-green prison uniform. His movements were severely restricted by heavy belly chains and leg irons that clinked rhythmically against the carpet. Reed refused to look at the gallery. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, terrified of meeting Sterling's gaze. As he took the oath and slumped into the witness box, the microphone picked up his ragged, shallow breathing. He was a broken man brought low by the very system he had abused, now forced to serve as the architect of his former boss's destruction. "Mr. Reed," a USA Wyatt began, stepping up to the wooden podium. "Can you describe for the jury the exact nature of the operation you and 3 other officers referred to as the street tax in Sector 3 of Oak Creek?" Reed swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. It was an organized protection racket. We specifically targeted minority-owned businesses, bodegas, laundromats, auto repair shops run by immigrants. We told them if they didn't pay a monthly cash envelope, they would stop receiving police response to their 911 calls. If they pushed back, we threatened to raid them for fabricated code violations or plant narcotics on their premises. A sickening murmur rippled through the jury box. Judge Taft shot a warning glare and the room silenced instantly. "And where did this extorted cash go, Mr. Reed?" Wyatt pressed, pacing slowly. "We kept a 20% cut for ourselves." Reed rasped, his voice trembling. "The remaining 80% was bundled and placed in a waterproof drop bag behind a grease dumpster at the Oak Creek Plaza Diner on the 1st of every month. Union President Curtis Hammond personally picked it up." Graves shot out of his chair like a coiled spring. "Objection. Your Honor, this is blatant hearsay. The witness has zero physical proof linking my client to these alleged drop-offs. This is nothing but the desperate, fabricated perjury of a disgraced, violent racist trying to shave years off his own federal sentence." "Overruled, Mr. Counsel. Take your seat," Judge Taft snapped, her tone dripping with absolute authority. Wyatt didn't miss a beat. He walked to the evidence table and picked up a weathered, red, leather-bound notebook sealed in a clear plastic evidence bag. "Your Honor, the prosecution offers Exhibit 42B into evidence." He handed it to the bailiff, who placed it in front of Reed. "Mr. Reed, can you identify this item?" Hammond's face turned the color of wet cement. He lunged toward Graves, whispering in a frantic, panicked hiss. "Yes," Reed said, a tear finally escaping and cutting a path through the stubble on his cheek. "It's my personal ledger. I kept it hidden inside the main air conditioning duct of my basement. It meticulously documents every single cash drop I made to Curtis Hammond over years. It has the exact dates, times, dollar amounts, and the initials of every single business we bled dry." The courtroom erupted in gasps. The undeniable proof was sitting right there in red leather. "Why did you keep this secret ledger, Mr. Reed?" Wyatt asked quietly, letting the gravity of the moment settle over the room. Reed finally lifted his head, his hollow, bloodshot eyes locked directly onto Hammond's terrified stare. "Because I knew the score. I knew men like Curtis Hammond only preached the brotherhood until the federal agent showed up. I knew the second the heat came down, I would be the sacrificial lamb. That book was my insurance policy." Nolan Graves's cross-examination was a bloodbath, but an entirely ineffective one. He played the damning dash cam footage from the parking lot, forcing the jury to listen to Reed's unhinged racial slurs and his terrifying threat to execute Agent Sterling. Graves hoped to paint Reed as a monster so thoroughly abhorrent that the jury wouldn't believe a single word he uttered. But the strategy backfired catastrophically. The footage merely cemented the jury's absolute disgust for the Oak Creek operation. If Hammond's union was aggressively protecting and funding a monster like Gregory Reed, the union itself was an undeniably toxic rot that needed to be excised. The following afternoon, Darius Sterling took the stand. His testimony was a masterclass in clinical, devastating precision. He didn't rely on emotion or embellishment. He calmly walked the jury through the timeline, the undeniable financial forensic evidence, and the terrifying reality of the parking lot assault. He painted a vivid picture of a badge weaponized against the public and the complex, bureaucratic web of corruption designed to shield those abusers from any real consequences. After a grueling trial that captivated the nation, the defense rested its case with a whimper. The jury retired to deliberate, carrying the heavy weight of the city's broken trust into the closed-door room. They only needed hours. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, the tension in courtroom 1419 was thick enough to choke on. Curtis Hammond closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and rapid. On count 1, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act violation, the foreperson read, their voice steady. We find the defendant, Curtis Hammond, guilty. The words struck like a physical blow. Hammond slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. On count 2, extortion under color of official right, guilty. On count 3, witness tampering, guilty. The litany continued. 24 counts, 24 guilty verdicts. The corrupt house of cards had completely collapsed, leaving nothing but the inescapable reality of federal prison. The gavel slammed down, adjourning the trial, but the true reckoning was still waiting in the wings for sentencing day. The morning brought a bitter, howling wind off Lake Michigan, whipping sleet against the towering glass and steel facade of the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse in downtown Chicago. Outside, a chaotic sea of satellite trucks, huddled reporters, and demonstrators barricaded the plaza. But inside courtroom 1419, the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. The heavy oak doors had been sealed. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with federal agents, local journalists, and the exhausted citizens of Oak Creek who had spent years living under the thumb of a badge-wearing syndicate. Supervisory Special Agent Darius Sterling sat in the second row wearing a sharply tailored navy suit. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, tracking every movement in the room. Beside him sat Assistant United States Attorney Elias Wyatt, quietly organizing his meticulously tabbed legal binders. Presiding over the chamber was the Honorable Judge Eleanor Taft. A veteran jurist with a notoriously low tolerance for public corruption, Judge Taft looked out over her courtroom with an expression carved from granite. Today was the culmination of a long legal siege, and the bill for years of systemic terror was finally coming due. The sentencing phase began with the man who had orchestrated the rot, Curtis Hammond. The former Union president was a ghost of the bulldog who had once stormed into Chief Thorpe's office. Stripped of his tailored suits and his sycophantic entourage, Hammond stood before the bench in a shapeless, oversized tan prison jumpsuit. His hands, which had happily collected tens of thousands of dollars in extorted street tax, trembled violently as he clutched the edge of the defense table. Mr. Hammond, Judge Taft's voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room, sharp and unforgiving. You were entrusted with the welfare of the men and women who put their lives on the line for the public. Instead, you weaponized their union. You operated a localized mafia, extorting the very minority business owners your officers were sworn to protect. You shielded violent, racist predators because they were effective earners for your illegal enterprise. You have stained the badge in a way that will take generations to wash clean. Hammond squeezed his eyes shut as Judge Taft delivered the hammer blow. On the charges of racketeering, extortion, and obstruction of justice, I sentence you to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early release. Furthermore, I am ordering restitution in the amount of millions effective immediately, resulting in the seizure of your pension, your properties, and your assets. A collective exhale rippled through the gallery as the U.S. Marshals stepped forward. They didn't offer Hammond the dignity of walking out under his own power. They seized his arms, snapped heavy steel cuffs around his wrists, and practically dragged the ruined kingmaker through the side door. But the courtroom didn't empty. The main event was yet to come. The side door opened once more and Gregory Reed shuffled in. If Hammond looked like a ghost, Reed looked like a walking corpse. The arrogance that had fueled his reign of terror on the streets of Oak Creek had been entirely hollowed out by nearly a year of federal pretrial solitary confinement. His hair had thinned and gone stark white at the temples. He wore thick institutional glasses and his ankles dragged against the carpet, shackled by heavy iron chains. Reed took his seat beside his court-appointed public defender, William Stanton. He kept his head bowed, terrified to meet the gaze of Darius Sterling sitting just a few feet behind him. Reed clung to a singular, desperate sliver of hope. He had flipped. He had provided the ledger that buried Hammond. Because of his cooperation, AUSA Wyatt had filed a 5K 1.1 motion, a formal request from the prosecution for a downward departure in sentencing due to substantial assistance. In Reed's desperate mind, this meant a light sentence, maybe years in a minimum security camp, maybe, if he cried enough, probation. Before the judge spoke, AUSA Wyatt stood up. Your Honor, before sentencing, the prosecution wishes to introduce a victim impact statement. The court calls Cynthia Brooks. Reed's head snapped up, his stomach plummeting into an icy abyss. An elegant, older black woman walked slowly down the center aisle. She was the mother of Malcolm Brooks, the young man whose jaw Reed had shattered with a flashlight during a routine traffic stop years prior. The union had buried the incident, paying the family a quiet settlement using extorted funds. But the federal investigation had ripped the confidentiality agreement to shreds. Cynthia stood at the podium, gripping the wood to steady herself. She looked directly at Reed. For years, Cynthia began, her voice shaking with raw, suppressed grief, I have had to watch my son wake up screaming. I had to feed him through a straw for months because you decided his life didn't matter. You broke his body and you broke his spirit, all while wearing a uniform that told the world you were a hero. You are not a hero, Mr. Reed. You are a coward who hid behind a piece of metal to hurt people who couldn't fight back. Tears streamed freely down Reed's sunken cheeks. The sterile legal defenses he had relied on for years dissolved in the face of absolute, undeniable human suffering. Cynthia turned to the judge. Please, Your Honor, do not let this man's sudden willingness to save himself erase the monster he was to my son and to so many others. When Cynthia sat down, the courtroom was deathly silent. Judge Taft adjusted her glasses and looked down at Reed. The public defender, Stanton, launched into a hurried, impassioned plea for mercy, citing Reed's critical testimony against the union and his deep, profound remorse. Thank you, Mr. Stanton, Judge Taft interrupted, her tone signaling that the defense's arguments had fallen on deaf ears. She turned her piercing gaze to the defendant. Mr. Reed, stand up. Reed struggled to his feet, the chains around his waist clinking loudly in the quiet room. The prosecution has honored their agreement, Judge Taft stated. They have requested leniency based on your cooperation. And it is true. Without your testimony, Curtis Hammond might have evaded justice. You were the linchpin of the government's case. Reed let out a ragged, hopeful breath. However, Taft continued, the temperature in the room seemingly dropping 10 degrees. A 5K 1.1 motion is a recommendation. I am the final arbiter of justice in this courtroom, and I have spent hours watching the dash cam footage from the night you assaulted Agent Sterling. Reed closed his eyes. The trap was springing shut. I watched you profile an innocent man based on the color of his skin, the judge said, her voice rising with righteous indignation. I listened to you use racially coded language. I watched you artificially escalate a peaceful encounter, draw a loaded firearm, and press it to the head of a compliant, unarmed citizen. You did not do this in the heat of a chaotic pursuit. You did this coldly, methodically, and with pure malice, simply because you felt you possessed the absolute, unchecked power to do so. Judge Taft leaned forward, looking directly into Reed's terrified eyes. Your cooperation in dismantling a corrupt syndicate does not act as a magical eraser for your own bigotry and violence. You flipped on your conspirators not out of a sudden burst of morality, but out of sheer, pathetic self-preservation. You are exactly the type of predator this justice system was built to eradicate. Reed's knees began to give out. Stanton had to grab his elbow to keep him upright. Gregory Reed, Judge Taft declared, raising her wooden gavel. I am categorically rejecting the prosecution's recommendation for a downward departure. For the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law utilizing a deadly weapon, I sentence you to 8 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Reed let out a guttural, wretched sob. It was the sound of a man watching his life utterly vaporize. Because of your background in law enforcement, Taft added coldly, you will likely spend the entirety of that decade in protective solitary confinement for your own safety, a 23-hour-a-day lockdown. You will have a very long time in a very small cell to reflect on the power you abused. Bang! The gavel cracked like a rifle shot. The hard karma Reed had spent years outrunning had finally caught him, and it showed absolutely no mercy. As the marshals hauled him away, he was weeping hysterically, begging for a chance to speak, pleading for a lighter sentence. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him, cutting off his cries, sealing him into a nightmare of his own making. Later that evening, the snowstorm had broken, leaving the streets of Chicago dusted in a quiet, pristine white. Darius Sterling sat in the driver's seat of his unmarked Ford Explorer parked near the edge of Lake Michigan. He had the heater running, holding a cardboard cup of black coffee. He was reading a digital briefing on his tablet regarding the sweeping changes happening in Oak Creek. Chief Victor Thorpe had been instrumental in signing a federal consent decree. The entire police department had been gutted and was being rebuilt from the ground up. The corrupt union had been permanently dissolved, replaced by a civilian oversight board chaired by local community leaders. It wasn't perfect, and the scars left by men like Reed and Hammond would take years to heal, but the rot had been surgically removed. The city could finally breathe. Darius locked his tablet and tossed it onto the passenger seat. He looked out over the dark, freezing waters of the lake. The job of a federal agent in the Public Corruption Unit was an endless, grueling marathon. There would always be another corrupt official, another compromised badge, another predator hiding behind authority. But tonight, the scales of justice had balanced perfectly. The arrogance of a racist cop in a dark parking lot had been met with the unyielding, overwhelming force of the rule of law. Darius shifted the SUV into drive. He pulled away from the lakefront, merging into the glowing stream of city traffic, ready for whatever the next case would bring. The storm was over, and the streets were finally clean. The Oak Creek parking lot incident wasn't just a confrontation. It was the catalyst that dismantled a localized empire of corruption. In the real world, karma rarely arrives in a single explosive moment. It is a slow, methodical dismantling of a person's pride, power, and freedom. Colton Reed believed his badge granted him immunity from the laws he swore to uphold, wielding his prejudice as a weapon. Instead, that very weapon was turned against him by a man who represented the true, unyielding weight of justice. Darius Sterling didn't just survive an unlawful stop. He orchestrated a masterclass in accountability. The fallout serves as a permanent, chilling reminder to those who hide their malice behind a uniform. The truth is relentless. Power without integrity is merely a borrowed illusion, and when the bill inevitably comes due, the scales of justice demand a heavy, absolute toll.